Welcome, everybody, to the latest edition of Bold Leaders in Learning. I'm your host, Brandon Bastide, Chief Partnership Officer and Global Head of Learn Work Innovation at Kaplan. And I'm delighted to have my guest, Roosevelt Montas, with me, who is a senior lecturer at Columbia University. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, Rescuing Socrates: How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. He's also the director of the Freedom and Citizenship Program at Columbia and has been involved in a number of other interesting things that we're going to talk about today. First of all, Roosevelt, thanks for joining. Would love to have you tell everybody a little bit more about your own personal background and academic career, and then we're going to certainly talk about your book and some of the observations from that.
Thank you, Brandon. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, as you said, I'm at Columbia. I've been at Columbia University actually a long time. I went there as an undergraduate and stayed for graduate school and then a faculty member and ran its core curriculum for 10 years and have recently gone back to the faculty. I am originally from the Dominican Republic. I came to the United States when I was 12 years old, not speaking English, with a single mother who also didn't speak English, and in some ways had a typical immigrant experience. That is, there's a big wave of migration from the Dominican Republic in the 80s, 90s, and which actually continues, of largely sort of economic refugees, people who come to make ends meet with more opportunities than there are available back home. So I went to public schools in Queens, the local public schools, bilingual education, relied on public assistance to make ends meet, and generally had, again, what is in some ways a typical struggling immigrant experience. I ended up going to Columbia almost as an accident. I was a serious student. I liked school, and in part, I was lucky to end up at a school, John Bowne High School, that was overwhelmingly immigrant, and many of the students, like me, took school seriously, had a kind of attitude about studying and about learning and about listening to what teachers said and about doing your homework that contrasted with many of the American students. So the many immigrants made the school intellectually rich and rigorous in a way that, in fact, didn't show up in the numbers because so many of us were second language English learning. So our test scores did not make the school stand out. On the contrary, but nonetheless, it was really fortunate to find myself in a kind of social environment at that school that took learning seriously. And that was enough to get me into Columbia, which the only thing I knew about Columbia was that it was a hard school to get into, the hardest school in the city to get into, and I didn't want to leave the city. And I went to Columbia, and there I encountered its famous core curriculum, a kind of sometimes described as a great books program, although it's not only books. You study art and you study music, and Columbia itself has always resisted the term great books. But it's heavy on classics, common intellectual experience for all the students. And there I encountered the classics: Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, Rousseau, Hobbes, Freud, Marx. And that education was profoundly transformative for me. And it really set me on a path to think about higher education and to think about the place of liberal education in higher education. And that has really shaped my career as a faculty member, as administrator of the program, and as kind of an advocate of this kind of liberal education, a kind of education that has traditionally been an elite education, has been the kind of education that the cultural elites get, but which is as transformative and as meaningful for everyone, and in fact, more important and more empowering for those people who have been traditionally excluded. So it's been a special commitment and passion of mine to make this type of education available to students who have been traditionally underrepresented in elite education.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm glad you kind of hit that point right off the bat. I mean, obviously, know it's a big theme of your book where you kind of talk about your own personal narrative, right? Of how this core curriculum and the great books transformed your own life and view of the world and view of academics. But you're right in that. I think the dialogue about the liberal arts. Well, there's a lot of dialogue about the liberal arts, right? Is it still relevant? Does it lead to a good job? But it's largely been viewed as something that's more of a luxury, right? For those who can afford to go to an expensive, elite or at least private, residential liberal arts college. And your point about it is that it has incredible value, perhaps even more value for those who are largely shut out of that universe. And so, maybe let's just start off with what the major points are that you kind of hit in the book. And then I obviously want to, talk a little bit more about that through the lens of how it might inform the rest of higher education, because as you know, there's a lot of debate about what should be taught, how should we teach it, core curriculum reviews, should we get rid of gen ed requirements? I mean, there's a lot going on. So, but anyway, tell us about some of the major points you make in the book.
Great. Well, we really do students tremendous misservice when we steer them, particularly low-income, first-generation, often minorities. We do them a tremendous disservice when we steer them away from the traditional liberal arts curriculum. There is a long and pernicious tradition, not just in American society, but in, I think, most societies, of steering working-class, low-income people towards an education in not asking questions, an education in doing as you're told, an education in servility. And the emphasis, an almost exclusive emphasis on practical market value education for those populations is an extension of that odious tradition. Now, it's important that one makes a distinction between a liberal education and majoring in the liberal arts, which are different things. I was a liberal arts major. I love liberal arts major. I like for people to major in liberal arts, but that's not the point. What we need is not just more English or art history majors. What we need is professionals of every kind that have a foundation in the liberal arts. So my kind of goal and my mission with this book and professionally is to advance liberal arts education for all. Not liberal arts majors, but liberal arts for the engineer, for the business, for the medicine. Liberal arts has its roots in the basic condition of human freedom. And it is a kind of education that is aimed at equipping an individual to maximize their freedom. It is the kind of education that asks people not what kind of job they want to do, but what kind of life they want to live. How do you organize your own perceptions of reality? How do you organize the economy of desires and goals and aims in your own interior life? How do you stand before the basic dilemmas of being a human being, of, what is my responsibility to the collective versus to the individuals? What is really worth striving for? How do we live in a just society? How much of my time should be dedicated to making a better world? How much should just be dedicated to making a better life for myself? All of these questions pertain to us fundamentally as human beings. And in fact, they are the questions that ultimately distinguish the mere professional from the leader in any field. So making liberal arts education available for everyone, and especially available for those populations that have traditionally been excluded from that education, is critically important in our time, critically important in this moment of social revolution and revolution in higher education. Yep. There is a great drift towards a kind of bifurcation of education where, the people who can, the social elites, not just American, but the global elite, will continue to seek out and pay for the kind of artisanal, small-scale, liberal arts education experience. And we are in danger of having that experience again become the exclusive province of that social elite with vocational and pre-professional and technical, often online education for everybody else. So it's critically important that we, and by we I mean a society and particularly higher education sector, renew our commitment to liberal education for all?
Yeah, so let's push on that, because what I hear you saying would be things like, it's not necessarily a push to get more people to major in the humanities, right, or in the classic, kind of liberal arts majors. It's not something that should be reserved exclusively for the small private residential institution, right, and and obviously the predominantly white and upper middle class or wealthy families that has been disproportionately reserved for. It's about infusing it across all of the different educational domains, perhaps even across other levels than just higher education,
Right.
which I know is another thing I want to ask you about, some of the high school programs that we've been running. And I even think about, one of the articles I wrote in Forbes was, a provocation towards thinking about liberal arts in corporate education, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I to this day, the best leadership course that I've ever taken was through Shakespeare text. It was a class on Shakespeare. And, I made the point that although I took that as an undergraduate, as part of a, public policy, major requirement, that course could have been extracted and taught in any corporate executive training in the world, and people would have, and if that was ever done, would rave about it. So, I mean, am I giving examples of the kinds of things that you're talking about when you say liberal arts for all?
I think so. The fundamental human questions that we struggle with when we think about policy, when we think about business, when we think about the free market, when we think about society, those fundamental human questions have remained fairly consistent for millennia. And we have a whole archive, a whole repository of thoughtful, penetrating, insightful reflection on these questions. And part of higher education, part of an education to be part of a self-governing society, ought to include grappling, encountering those approaches to those questions that we live with and that we have to solve in our own way, that we have to use contemporary tools and contemporary instantiations of those problems to work through our reality. The notion that this is only a kind of leisured activity for as a kind of pastime, that what really matters is kind of economic self-empowerment. That's a really misguided notion. And part of that is reflected in the emphasis on majoring, kind of specializing in the liberal arts. And, it makes sense. If you take a student like myself or a student who comes from a low-income family, whose family is looking to them as a kind of economic lifeline, who are looking to come out from under the heel of extreme poverty, deprivation, marginalization. And you put them in a college and you say, well, you will either study art history or engineering. What do you think? Well, this person is going to study engineering. So we need to eliminate the opportunity cost of liberal arts education by generalizing it, by making liberal education the foundation of all the other forms of professionalization and learning. It is a traditional kind of mission of the college to do this. It is a traditional mission of the college to equip students for positions of, roughly speaking, civic leadership. I have had a lot of experience, and I've heard a lot of stories of the kind that you discuss. People who are in industry, people who are leaders in business, leaders in various often cutting edge sectors, who say, when I look back at my education, it was those courses that dealt with kind of root questions that deepened my own sense of humanity, that have in the long run been the most important to the kind of professional I am, to the kind of work that I do, to my success. I've heard Nobel laureates talk about, well, those literature courses I took as a freshman, those have been the ones that have distinguished me from my academic peers. So that's really important. And just to add to the point you made about, this doesn't and shouldn't be only kind of an undergraduate experience. It's important in professional schools. It's important in medical school. It's important in business school. It's the bread and butter of legal theory, even in technical schools. even as a kind of lifelong learning activity where people are not earning college credits, are not getting a degree, but are simply manifesting something that's fundamental to our condition of humanity, which is our desire to know, our desire to expand our horizons. Yes, liberal education should be, in a way, the borders, the institutional constraints under which it has operated really ought to be increasingly dissolved, so that it becomes a pervasive aspect of education, of what it means to learn, what it means to broaden one's horizons.
Yeah. So, I mean, not simply relegated to an undergraduate bachelor's degree, which is where, when we say liberal arts, that's what most people think of in terms of where it lives, right? It lives in that place. And, how dare it live in high school, or how dare it live in technical training programs, or but those are the opportunities that really exist. And, every research project I've ever been a part of where employers are surveyed about what they're looking for in graduates, or what's missing from college graduates, or whatever it is, there is a consistent drumbeat of them saying things like, I want somebody to be broadly educated, right, in the sense of kind of understanding how to grapple with big questions and ethical dilemma and, the human condition in ways that, inspire a different kind of critical thinking. Yes, they also want them to be specifically skilled, but they don't want just the specific skills, right? And they also, on the other end, they don't want just the liberally trained scholar who's had no work experience, no, connectivity to, some of the, the tools and skills that might be valued in a workplace, whether that's understanding Excel spreadsheets or whatever, right? And so, so that's the challenge. So take me to some of the lessons you've learned in thinking deeply about the core curriculum at a place like Columbia. I know you've advised a lot of other universities on this, right? Like, what have we learned from real, kind of exploration of the core curriculum to what could be taken out of that core curriculum, or how that core curriculum can be scaled? I'm just curious what big insights you have from that.
Great. There are a couple of things that stand out from my experience. One is that this type of education is meaningful to students. There is a kind of condescending and uninformed idea that young people are not going to be moved and interested and connected to this kind of education. But the contrary is the case. 17, 18-year-olds, the typical college students thinking about the college period now, are obsessed with moral and existential questions. They are trying to ground their lives, not just in a professional skill, but in a philosophy of life. They're trying to orient themselves in a larger world. And this type of education speaks to them profoundly. So that's the first thing that I have learned, that if you give students an opportunity to engage in this kind of reflection, in this kind of discussion, in this kind of mind expanding, non-applied sort of education, they will cherish it. They will flock to it. Another thing that I've observed and that I've learned is that this kind of education cannot be mass produced. That is, that this kind of education happens as I think one can think about it as a kind of artisanal sort of education. It happens in small groups and it happens in conversations. So we do need a dedicated professoriate. We do need people whose main job is not to research and publish scholarly articles. That's always a part of the profession. But you need to create institutional structures that welcome, reward, and nourish the kind of professoriate whose interest is in the personal development of students. The kind of personal relationship between the teacher and the student is absolutely fundamental to liberal education. It's got to happen in small settings. It has to happen by contagion rather than by just instruction. I guess another thing that has been evident to me from working is that I've already alluded to this, that doing liberal education through the study of works that have significantly shaped the modern world. Sometimes it's called great books, but works that have proven their capacity to speak about basic human questions to many different kinds of people over many different generations. That is, works who transcend the historical conditions of their own creation are, in my view, the most powerful vehicle for conducting liberal education. Now, that does raise, I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but it does raise the issue that ancient works, these kind of classics, do not represent our demographic diversity. And that's something that we have to deal with. And we should teach those not at the exclusion of diverse voices, but certainly not exclude them in order to include diverse voices. One last thing I would mention about what I have learned from working with a lot of schools is that a critical impediment to revitalizing liberal education in our colleges and universities is the dominance of disciplinary specialization in colleges and universities, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences. Yeah. Careers are built, are advanced through specialized research that addresses itself to scholarly questions, not to human questions that are of no interest to the general learner or to the undergraduate student, but only of interest to your academic colleagues. And it is your exploration of those questions that advances your career. And that is a profound and profoundly perverse incentive to liberal education, so that our universities, which should be the bastions of liberal education, often fail miserably at delivering a meaningful liberal education. And one of the results of that is that students are flocking away from the liberal arts and from liberal study, because what's being offered to them has been so removed from kind of the fountains of human significance that breathe really life into liberal education.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. I mean, you talked about the importance of the engaged professoriate. Obviously, when there's incentives within, how you get ahead in that context that, are kind of counter to, what you've seen as, critical success for kind of, scaling this. And, to your point, it can't be mass produced, but it can scale, right? It can scale if you have the right incentives in place, right? Where there is a focus on that teaching, right? And obviously not going down that, the overly narrow and less relevant, type of context as you just described there. So I think, that's a really big challenge. Unless, you've got brave leaders at the, senior leadership level that are willing to go in some, new directions with incentives and rewards, that's a real challenge. But, I wanted to make sure before we wrap up, we've got about, 5 minutes or so left. I wanted to have you tell us a little bit about the program you're running with high school students in New York City. To me, that's a great example of, the wonderful applications of this in ways that most people probably wouldn't have immediately thought of. So.
Thank you. I love teaching in this program. It is just the most fulfilling and in some ways important thing that I see myself as doing. This is a program we started at Columbia 13 years ago now. Simple idea. We were going to find initially 15 students who were high school students finishing their junior year, who were low income and who were the first in their family hoping to go to college. We're going to bring them to campus, have them live for a month in Columbia, sleep in the dorms, eat cafeteria food, and take a humanities seminar with a Columbia faculty member, me in that case. And it was a course that I called Freedom and Citizenship. And it was an introduction to, roughly speaking, political theory. We read Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And then the last portion of the course looks at American issues, Lincoln and Jefferson and Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement and contemporary questions of kind of import in our society. So they spend a month having this intellectual experience, no grades, no charge, obviously it's free for them. And then in their senior year of college, we matched them up with a mentor, a Columbia undergraduate student who helps them prepare applications to college. One thing about Columbia students is that they are really good at getting into good schools. And they're really good at telling their own stories in a way that is compelling and interesting, even when sometimes their stories aren't that compelling and interesting.
Right.
Our students, the summer low-income students who are driven and hungry and exceptional in lots of ways, but don't know it and don't know how to tell those stories. Putting those two together has been such a powerful experience for both the students, the undergraduate students and the college students. So in their senior year, we helped them apply into college. Over the 13 years we've been doing this, we've grown the program to 45 students rather than the original 15, with 2 additional professors besides myself. We have nearly 100% acceptance rate into college. Nearly all of our students go to college. The graduation rates are from college in a 5-year graduation rate is better than the Columbia 5-year graduation rate.
Wow.
They participate in campus leadership roles at a higher rate than their peers. One of them from our first class just recently won the Democratic nomination for the Columbia district to the New York City City Council. So given that New York City elections largely take place at the Democratic primary, he is almost for sure will be the next city council person for the city council district in which Columbia sits. He's a graduate of our program. So I have seen the transformative power of putting before the students serious text, serious ideas, serious discussion. They learn that they have the standing to speak to and participate in the collective shaping of our national destiny.
Yeah, and to your point about how if it's done well, it's something that engages students, that they're excited about, that they love to take part of, right? And I hope none of us forgets that that's one of the fundamental opportunities here, right? Is to get I think about this certainly with very young children, but learners of all ages, to get them excited about what they're learning, right? Like that we don't talk about that as much as we should, but it's just such a powerful, fundamental driver of success. And so, when you think about, the soundbite world that we live in between social media and news sources, right? I do believe there's a lot of folks who are craving deeper discussion, deeper dialogue, deeper meaning, looking for a deeper sense of purpose. We're seeing this in what's called the Great Resignation right now, right? Mm-hmm. People resigning from jobs in droves, and 10 million jobs open in the United States, 8 million people looking for work. I mean, it tells you a lot of things, right? Yep, there's a skills gap, but there's also, people evaluating work and saying, you know what, I didn't like that work, or I want something different. I want something more meaningful. So I do think we've got, a national opportunity here at a time when arguably the liberal arts is as banged up and bruised up as it's ever been in terms of the, its perception. But its value still remains, as great as ever. And so I'm grateful for the work you're doing. I'm grateful for the voice you're putting out there. Your book is due out. Tell me the exact date. November 2nd. Okay, good stuff. So folks who are looking for Rescuing Socrates, Princeton Review, Princeton Press is the publisher. Is that right?
That's right. Princeton University Press, Rescuing Socrates.
Terrific. Well, and I know also in addition to a new book launching, it sounds like you have a new addition to the family on the way. So good luck to you. You have been busy.
Thank you very much. That will be the big event of the fall.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you, Roosevelt, so much for joining us on Bold Leaders in Learning, and keep up your bold leadership in driving the liberal arts to a place where more of us can benefit from it. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Brandon.